So guys, let's not beat around the bush. I was wrong about the new BLANCPAIN SWATCH collaboration. A lot of the information that I put out in my last video, I believed in. I corroborated it with a number of people. But ultimately, it wasn't accurate. But I thought it was only fair to make this video to explain to you guys why I drew the conclusions that I did, to give you a bit more insight into how I came by the information that I published, to apologise for misleading you, even if it was inadvertently. And I also wanted to talk about this new release, what we now know, the images that we've seen that Swatch Group have released, and tell you what I think of it. So last Friday, when I first became aware of the teaser advert that Swatch Group had published in the German newspaper, very clearly giving us lots of clues that there was a new Swatch collab coming, I pretty quickly worked out that it was going to be with BLANCPAIN, as I'm sure many of you did. I think it was pretty obvious by the shape of the crown on that design. There was no logo obviously shown apart from the S from the Swatch logo. But it was too soon for them to do another collab with Omega. We knew because of the image it had to be a dive watch. And there aren't really many other brands in the Swatch Group portfolio that I think they will do this kind of collaboration with. Maybe Glashütte Original, but that's too small a brand, even less well known than BLANCPAIN. Certainly not going to be Breguet. I think it would be sacrilege if they did this kind of collaboration with a Breguet design. So like many of you, I got quite excited seeing that advert and straight away got to work trying to do a bit of research in order to understand a bit more about what might be coming. And I made a video talking about what I knew at the time, and with a bit of speculation and a few renders of what I thought we might see from Swatch Group, which ironically, the renders in that video were probably more accurate, because I thought that we were going to get something styled very closely on the original 50 Fathoms, or possibly on the Tech Gone Besser, which was a more modern version launched last year. And that's what my renders were based on. So after uploading that video, I shared a few of my initial renders on social media, on Instagram. And I started getting some interesting reactions and a few messages. One message in particular dropped into my inbox, and it was from somebody who I knew of, but had not previously had any contact with. And I know of this person because they are very, very well connected in the watch world, particularly with the Swatch Group. I can't name them because I don't want to damage their relationship with the Swatch Group. I mean, some of these people that I'm going to talk about today have got commercial relationships, and divulging their names and saying what they had told me, which was at the time confidential information, whether it was accurate or not, would only lead to trouble. So the message that came into my inbox just had one word, and it was bathyscaphe, which of course was incredibly intriguing, because up to that point I'd been thinking that we were going to be looking at a 50 Fathoms influence design. So I exchanged a number of messages with this person, and it soon came to light that they had been shown a prototype of the BLANCPAIN Swatch collaboration in October 2022, so just under a year ago. Now this prototype had apparently been shown to a number of high-profile customers of Swatch Group, and also to several people from the world's watch media. And whereas I hitherto wasn't going to share the image of that prototype, I'm going to put it on the screen now, because I think that will give you guys an indication of how I arrived at the conclusions that I did. So that prototype was clearly based on the design of the bathyscaphe, as you can see, rather than the 50 Fathoms. And it's clear from that 12 months ago, this was the direction that Swatch Group were taking. Now, a couple of hours after receiving that image, I see a comment on my Instagram feed in relation to one of the renders that I had posted. And it's from Rob Broer. Rob is one of the top watch media guys in the world. His business, Fratello Watches, is the European equivalent of Hodinkee. He's a huge Speedmaster collector and fan as well. He's very close to Omega and to Swatch Group, Now it's clear from his comment that he had also seen this prototype, he'd potentially been at the same meeting. I reached out to a couple of other industry guys who I know, who I thought there was a high likelihood had also seen this prototype and been involved in some of these kinds of meetings. And so I asked them a few questions, and the answers I got back from them corroborated everything that I'd been told up to that point. That it was going to be a bathyscaphe-based design, that it was going to use the System 51 movement, that it was going to be named the System 51 Fathoms, and it was going to be made from bioceramic and available in a range of colours. I guess the last couple of things were pretty obvious. So now, having had this information confirmed by 4 separate people, some of whom may not know each other, I was pretty certain that the information was accurate and that I was on safe ground to make that video. Which, let's face it guys, I was pretty excited by this, because if you've got that kind of information, you feel pretty privileged. So fast forward to yesterday evening, and there was some stuff posted on Reddit which appeared to show the new Swatch releases, and it looked like genuine artwork from a Swatch Group poster or an advert. We've now subsequently learnt that it was actually a leak. So these did show the watches that were about to be released. Now Swatch Group, very shortly after this, made an official announcement and actually then posted images of the actual watches. Now, I think that this was probably a knee-jerk reaction to the images that had leaked. I think it was unplanned. I think it was PR damage control, because up to this point, the launch had followed the playbook that they'd created for the Moonswatch. And if you remember, they didn't release any images of the Moonswatch until the day of launch. And I think that that was intended to happen with this new launch again. Now, those images, which by now I'm sure you've all seen, are markedly different to the renders that I'd created based on the information that I'd believe to be correct. So moving on, and what do we actually now know about this new release that's dropping on the 9th? Well, Swatch has clearly taken design direction from the OG 50 Fathoms rather than the bathyscaphe. And I think that they've made the right call. If you think about it, BLANCPAIN as a brand is already little known outside the watch community. The BLANCPAIN bathyscaphe is probably even less known than the 50 Fathoms. So if they were wanting to shine a spotlight on the BLANCPAIN brand, then surely you pick their most iconic watch. God, hindsight's such a wonderful thing. So there are 5 versions, and each one is themed around one of the world's oceans. These 5 versions all use different colorways, and they take some design cues from some of the more famous iterations of the 50 Fathoms over the years. The case is of course bioceramic, and it measures just over 42 millimeters, so it's going to be pretty wearable. They all come on a NATO style one-piece strap, which is made from recycled Tide ocean material, effectively recycled plastic collected from the ocean. Now, this isn't new. Christopher Ward has been using Tide ocean material on its products for a couple of years now, but I think it's a really nice touch, and it ties in very well with the ocean theme. Now, as expected, the movement in this watch is not quartz like the Moonswatch. It's a System 51 automatic movement, which is pretty innovative because it's made from just 51 components, all of which are made from plastic, and it's assembled effectively by robots. That movement is visible through an exhibition caseback, and the rotor is decorated with the design of a nudibranch. Nudibranch or nudibranch? Apparently it's an ocean creature. I'm showing my ignorance here, but I'd never heard of it prior to this release. So if Swatch Group's intention was to create awareness for the BLANCPAIN brand, they've also inadvertently created an awful lot more awareness for the humble nudibranch. Now, there are several little Easter eggs incorporated into the design of these watches, but one of my favourites has got to be the water resistance rating. So these have a depth rating of 91 meters. Now, 91 meters, if you're not already aware, translates to exactly 50 fathoms. Now, I think that's pretty clever, but what I also think is that may be the reason why Swatch decided not to use the name System 51 Fathoms, because that name combined with this water resistance might have just been taking things a bit too far. Instead, they've called this series of watches the BLANCPAIN X Swatch 50 Fathoms Scuba. Now, of these 5 versions, my 2 favourites are the Atlantic and the Antarctic. Now, the Atlantic has a primarily blue colourway, and I think the colour combination of the different blues just works really well. The Antarctic features a white and grey design. It would make a great summer watch, for example. Now, as for the things that I don't love quite so much about this new release, well, going back to those colours and versions, of the 5, whilst I think that 2 work really well and really appeal to me, the other 3 I'm much less convinced by. But hey, I get it, colours and design are very much a subjective thing, and just because I don't like them doesn't mean that you won't. The crystal is something that I haven't been able to find a huge amount of information about so far, in terms of the material that they've used. I'm not sure whether this is an acrylic crystal. All I've really been able to learn about it so far is that it has a scratch-resistant coating. Now, I suspect that it's still acrylic, but at this kind of price point, I'd like to think that it had mineral crystal. Now, the price is another issue for me. Now, in the UK, these are going to retail for £340, $400 if you're in the US. Now, I was expecting these watches to have a price uplift over the Moonswatch, particularly because they use that System 51 automatic movement. But this is quite some price hike. Now, you can pick up a Swatch System 51 from that range in the UK here, starting from about £120. So to have so much of a premium over the price of the Moonswatch, I think it's a little high. And while Swatch Group have only given us renders of the watches so far, the Hodinkee article that came out last night had some pictures of the physical watches and showed some on people's wrists. And the thing that jumped out to me was that these watches looked a little bit more plasticky than even the Moonswatch. Now, it's made of the same material, bioceramic. I don't know whether it's to do with that kind of Bakelite style bezel that they've tried to create and the way that that reflects, but it just looked like a cheaper product, a bit more of a toy. And especially given that the price of these is higher than the Moonswatch, it really doesn't sit very well with me. Now, with that being said, none of us, with the exception perhaps of Hodinkee, have seen these watches in the flesh or in the bioceramic, so it's hard to kind of make a judgment call on that one until we do. The other thing that I take some issue with, and I think is going to be quite contentious, is the route to market that Swatch Group has chosen to use with this release, which is essentially the same as they did with the Moonswatch. So as I had suspected, this is going to be a boutique-only launch. The watch is only going to be available from Swatch boutiques, selected Swatch boutiques, on the 9th. And they're going to prove pretty hard to get. I really don't like the way that Swatch Group are trying to artificially restrict supply of these watches, and I do wish that it was easier for them to get into the hands of enthusiasts. After all, this isn't a premium product. I mean, you're not buying a Rolex. And I think many people who do want one are probably going to hold off until some of the hype has died down. It's pretty obvious that by taking this approach again, Swatch Group are creating a market for flippers, and I think just as with the Moonswatch, by Saturday evening, these watches will be appearing on sites like eBay at 3, 4, 5 times the retail price, and they really aren't worth that. So guys, that was a lot to get into one video, but I'd love to know what you think of these new releases, so please tell me in the comments. Tell me which ones are your favourites, and what you think of the design overall. Also, tell me what you think that these will do for the BLANCPAIN brand. Do you think that this will create the exposure and the awareness that Swatch Group are hoping for? And guys, once again, I want to apologise that the information that I put out in my last video didn't prove to be accurate. But hopefully now you have a slightly better insight as to why I drew the conclusions that I did. I've certainly learnt to take a beat before sharing this kind of information again. And for now, I guess I'll just be in Swatch pain.